The HVAC system on the 42nd floor of the Chicago high-rise always shifted its frequency at exactly 10 o'clock at night. It dropped from a steady, forced air rush to a low metallic hum that vibrated through the soles of my Oxfords. I knew this because I had spent the last 21 nights alone in the accounting department, tearing apart the financial architecture of Gardner Logistics. The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling glass in the corridor, a violent Lake Michigan squall distorting the amber streetlights into blurred, bleeding streaks. I had my leather briefcase in my right hand, the brass clasp already snapped shut, ready to head to the elevators and back to an apartment that felt more like a storage unit than a home. My life was optimized, precise, and entirely hollow. I was 29, a forensic accountant who saw human behavior only as data points in a ledger, and I was fine with that. Or so I told myself. Then I heard the sound. It was sharp. It was a ragged, fractured inhale trying to masquerade as silence, slipping out from the cracked mahogany door of the executive suite. I stopped walking. The hallway was dark, illuminated only by the emergency exit signs casting a pale red glow on the carpet. I shifted my grip on my briefcase. The logical move was to keep walking. Executives didn't want witnesses to their humanity. But the sound came again, heavier this time, carrying the specific weight of a structural collapse. I turned and pushed the heavy door open just enough to step inside. The corner office was a cavern of shadows and city light. Madeline Gardner wasn't sitting behind her massive, commanding desk. She was curled into one of the plush, oatmeal-colored visitor chairs near the window. She wore a cream-colored tailored suit, the fabric usually an impeccable armor, but her posture was entirely broken. Her knees were drawn tight, and she had a crumpled white tissue pressed hard against her mouth. Her shoulders shook with the physical force of a sob she was violently trying to swallow. I stood in the doorway, the damp wool of my suit suddenly feeling suffocatingly heavy. For a CEO who ruled a logistics empire with absolute unflinching competence, this level of vulnerability was catastrophic. She heard my footsteps on the hardwood perimeter. She looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed, the exhaustion carved so deeply into her face she looked like a stranger. She didn't bark an order. She didn't tell me to get out or threaten my job. She just stared at me, the rain hammering the reinforced glass behind her, and her voice broke completely as she whispered, "Please don't leave." I didn't move toward her immediately. Moving too fast in a room where someone was actively falling apart was a tactical error. It triggered defense mechanisms. Instead, I set my briefcase down on the floor by the doorframe. The click of the leather hitting the wood was the only sound in the room besides the storm. I walked over to the executive wet bar, took a clean glass and poured water from the chilled carafe. I walked over to the glass table next to her chair and set it down, making sure the coaster caught the condensation. I kept my hands out of my pockets, visible, steadying, and took a deliberate step back. "I'm not going anywhere, Madeline," I said. My voice was low, devoid of pity, presenting nothing but a concrete fact. I didn't ask what was wrong. I let the silence demand the truth. She reached for the glass. Her fingers trembled so severely the water sloshed against the crystal rim. She took a shaky exhale, pressing her lips together before she spoke. "Vance," she said, the name tasting like ash in the quiet room. "He filed the formal grievance with the board an hour ago. He documented 3 instances where he claims I bypassed union regulations to authorize the unauthorized night routes. He's calling an emergency session tomorrow morning. He's aiming for a vote of no confidence to trigger the Vanguard buyout clause." Vance, her VP of operations, the man I had been quietly tracking through the expense reports for a month. He was a corporate parasite, slowly orchestrating a hostile takeover by eroding her credibility from the inside out, preparing to sell the company for parts. He attached your name to the authorization logs, Jackson, she added, looking down at the glass in her hands, her voice hollowing out. He manipulated the timestamps. He's claiming the accounting department, you specifically, signed off on the overtime discrepancy to hide my tracks. He's framing us both. He's going to sink this entire company, and he's going to take your CPA license with it. The floor didn't drop out from under me. I didn't feel the blind panic she expected. Instead, I felt a cold, familiar clarity settle over my ribs. Forensic accounting wasn't about math. It was about human behavior. Fraud always left a fingerprint, no matter how carefully the crime scene was wiped. Vance is sloppy, I said. I pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down, maintaining exactly 3 feet of distance. He thinks because he understands supply chain operations, he understands data architecture. He has the system logs, Jackson, she said, the despair creeping back into her tone, thick and heavy. He printed them. He has the ink on paper. He has the front-end graphical outputs, I corrected. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on my knees, locking my eyes onto hers to force her to focus on the logic, not the fear. The SQL database tracks every edit stroke with an unalterable ghost ledger. He didn't cover his tracks at the root directory level because men like Vance don't know the root directory exists. She blinked, the tears stopping, replaced by a desperate, flickering kind of focus. Can you prove that? I need access to the server room, the physical terminal, now. I didn't wait for her permission. I stood up. I didn't offer a hand to help her out of the chair. She didn't need a savior. She needed a strategist. She stood, smoothing the wrinkles from her cream skirt, her heels clicking a sharp staccato rhythm on the hardwood as she followed me out the door. The executive elevator took us down to the 40th floor. When I badged us into the server room, the industrial air conditioning hit us like a physical wall. The hum of the mainframe racks was deafening, a wall of white noise and blinking blue lights. I pulled up a maintenance terminal, bypassed the standard user interface and dropped straight into the command line interface. The screen went black, filled with stark white text. For 45 minutes, my fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. I didn't speak. I isolated the transaction IDs associated with Vance's grievance dates. I cross-referenced the active logs with the Ghost Ledger archives. Madeline stood directly behind my right shoulder. I could smell the faint trace of vanilla and the damp, cold ozone of the rain on her suit jacket. It wasn't distracting. It was an anchor. It reminded me exactly who I was working for. I pulled the raw data packets. Look at the screen, I said, pointing to a dense string of hexadecimal code. I didn't use technical jargon to sound superior. I used it to arm her with the weapon she needed. Timestamp 2245. The active ledger shows your executive authorization code, but the ghost ledger shows an override sequence initiated from MAC address ending in 4A2C. That correlates to IP address 192.168.1.14. Vance's terminal, she whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical strike. Exactly. I'm extracting the raw hex data right now. I typed the final command. I am cryptographically hashing the file. Once it's hashed, it's mathematically sealed. He cannot claim we altered this data after the fact. It is absolute, measurable proof of manipulation. I saved the files to a secure encrypted flash drive I kept on my keychain, pulled it from the USB port, and stood up. I held the cold metal drive out to her. As she took it, her fingers brushed the edge of my knuckles. Her skin was freezing from the server room air, but the tremor in her hands had completely vanished. "We fight," she said, her voice dropping an octave, the CEO returning to her throne. The next morning, the primary boardroom was suffocating. 12 board members sat around the long, polished oak table, their expressions grim and impatient. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and impending execution. Vance stood at the head of the room, projecting a PowerPoint slide showing the unauthorized overtime spend. He was wearing a charcoal suit and a smug, perfectly practiced look of deep corporate concern. "It pains me to bring this forward to the committee," Vance said smoothly, placing a hand on his chest. "But the fiduciary duty to this company and the legal liability created by the CEO and her accounting department leaves me no choice. The logs clearly show." "Save the performance, Vance. You're not on stage," Madeline said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't stand up. She sat perfectly straight in her leather chair, the cream suit from last night replaced by a sharp, unforgiving navy blazer. She reached into her pocket and placed the encrypted flash drive onto the center of the oak table. It landed with a heavy, final clack. Vance faltered, his laser pointer dipping away from the screen. "What is that?" I stood up from my seat at the perimeter of the room, designated for staff. I didn't ask for permission to speak. I walked directly to the projector podium, disconnected Vance's laptop without looking at him, and plugged the drive into the main hub. I tapped the keyboard, bringing up the hashed data files on the massive screen. "That," I said, my voice carrying clearly, echoing off the glass walls, "is the cryptographic hash of the SQL Ghost Ledger. It proves, with absolute mathematical certainty, that the authorization codes for the night routes were overridden by an IP address assigned to your office terminal, Vance. Not the CEO's office. Not my accounting department." The room went dead silent. It was the kind of silence where you could hear the blood rushing in your own ears. The kind of silence where careers end instantly. "This is absurd," Vance sputtered, his face flushing a dangerous, mottled red. "Those logs are internal. They can be manipulated by anyone in IT or accounting. Not once they're hashed." I cut him off, my tone flat and lethal. "I've already forwarded a physical copy of the raw data packets to the external auditing firm, complete with the chain of custody documentation signed by the IT director at 2 a.m. last night. If you want to dispute the integrity of the data, you can do it with the federal auditors." Vance looked around the table. The board chairman, a man who usually backed Vance, was staring at the screen with cold disgust. No one met Vance's eye. The threat was neutralized, not with drama, not with yelling, but with measurable, undeniable reality. The meeting was adjourned pending a formal investigation into Vance's actions. An hour later, Madeline and I were back in her office. The adrenaline of the morning had evaporated, leaving behind a heavy, hollow exhaustion. She walked over to the coffee machine in the corner. She looked at the pods, her shoulders dropping an inch. She didn't move to make a cup. I stood up from the leather sofa. I walked over, gently took the ceramic mug from her hand, and selected the dark roast pod. I didn't ask what she wanted. I just remembered that she only drank the lighter roasts when she was trying to calm her nerves, and the dark, bitter roast when she needed to rebuild her armor for the rest of the day. I hit the brew button. The machine whirred to life. "You didn't have to put your own reputation on the line in there," she said softly, watching the dark liquid drip into the mug. "Vance isn't dead yet. He has allies on the board. He will come for you now. He'll scrutinize every audit you've ever filed looking for a mistake. Let him." I handed her the mug, making sure our fingers didn't touch. "My work is clean. I don't leave gaps for men like him to crawl through." She took a sip, closing her eyes for a brief, fleeting second. The small action, trusting me enough to close her eyes in my presence, shifted something fundamental in the room. It wasn't romantic. It was a pure, unadulterated transfer of trust. Thank you, Jackson. Over the next 4 weeks, the atmosphere in the office changed into a siege mentality. Vance was placed on administrative leave, his authority stripped pending the external review, but the hostile takeover threat hadn't vanished. The board was still terrified. The Vanguard buyout clause was still active in our debt covenants. If our quarterly operating margins dropped below 4%, Vanguard could force a liquidation sale. We essentially moved into the executive war room. It was a windowless space on the 41st floor, lined with whiteboards and monitors. The dynamics shifted entirely. Outside this room, Madeline was the untouchable CEO. Inside this room, she was a strategist running on fumes, and I became the architect of her defense. One Tuesday evening, the building's heating system failed during a sudden temperature drop. The air in the war room turned frigid within an hour. Madeline was sitting at the conference table trying to highlight a massive spreadsheet of mezzanine debt structures, but her hand was shaking from the cold. She didn't complain. She just kept reading. I didn't say a word. I stood up, took off my suit jacket, walked behind her chair, and draped it over her shoulders. The wool was still heavy and warm from my body. She went perfectly still, her highlighter pausing on the paper. I didn't linger. I didn't let my hands brush her neck or offer a comforting squeeze. I stepped immediately back to my side of the table and sat down, pulling up the next PDF on my monitor. "Better?" I asked, not looking up from the screen. "Yes," she whispered, pulling the dark wool lapels closer to her throat. "Thank you." The tension in that room was entirely built on the space I was choosing to maintain. I respected her too much to blur the professional lines while she was fighting for the life of her company. Every time I wanted to reach across the table and take her hand, I gripped my pen tighter until my knuckles turned white. I turned my intense, hyper-focused energy into the numbers. Discipline over impulse. Sanctuary over sensation. Thursday afternoon, the silence of the war room was shattered by my phone buzzing against the glass table. It was Remy, my best friend from college and a corporate lawyer at a top-tier firm. "Jax," Remy said, his voice tight with professional urgency. "I just saw filing cross the wire. Vanguard Holdings, the firm Vance was secretly feeding information to, just purchased 30% of your primary supply chain debt from a secondary lender. They are calling the loans early. They cited the internal investigation into Vance as a material breach of stability." I felt the blood drain from my face. I hung up the phone and looked across the table at Madeline. She had already seen the notification on her own terminal. Her face was ashen. "They triggered the acceleration clause," she said, her voice completely devoid of emotion. "We have 72 hours to secure refinancing or Vanguard forces liquidation." They bypassed the board vote entirely. This was the midpoint, the earth shifting beneath our feet. The financial freeze was instantaneous. She stood up, pacing the length of the war room, her heels digging into the carpet. "I can't save it, Jackson. Not in 3 days. No institutional bank will touch us with an active internal audit and a suspended VP of operations. The risk profile is radioactive." She stopped pacing and wrapped her arms around herself, staring blankly at the whiteboard. It was the posture of a woman who had carried a boulder up a mountain for 10 years, only to watch it roll back down to the bottom. I walked over to her. I didn't offer a hollow platitude. I didn't tell her it would be okay because mathematically, it wasn't. I reached out and took her hands, gently but firmly pulling them away from her sides. The physical contact acted as an immediate grounding wire. I felt the erratic, frantic energy in her fingers, the panic of a leader who had run out of moves. I forced my own grip to be absolute, steady, unmovable. I let the stillness of my pulse transfer to hers. We stood there in the harsh fluorescent light of the war room, the noise of the corporate panic locked out by the simple geometry of my hands holding hers. "We don't need a bank," I said, my voice low and level. "Vanguard bought the debt, but they bought it through a European shell structure. I saw the filing codes. I know the parent company's tax liabilities." I dropped her hands, immediately pivoting to the whiteboard and picking up a black dry erase marker. "I've been tracking Vanguard's aggressive acquisitions for the last week as a contingency. They are massively over-leveraged in the European logistics market. If they force our liquidation, they'd take a severe short-term capital gains tax hit on the write-down under the new EU regulations. They don't actually want the physical trucks or the warehouses. They want the intellectual property. They want our proprietary routing algorithms. I drew a quick, sharp structural diagram on the board, slashing lines connecting the entities. We don't ask for refinancing. We force a restructure. We threaten to open source the routing algorithms to the public domain if they push the acceleration clause. Madeline stared at the board, her mind catching up to the brutal, beautiful logic of the strategy. The despair in her eyes evaporated, replaced by a sharp, dangerous intelligence. That's mutual destruction. If we open source the IP, our valuation drops by 40%. It's leverage, I corrected her, tapping the marker against the board. I need 24 hours to draft the counter terms and calculate the exact tax penalty they will face. You need to call the board, bypass Vance's allies, and set an emergency meeting with Vanguard's legal counsel for Saturday morning. For the next day and a half, I didn't leave my apartment. I sat at my dining table surrounded by 3 glowing monitors, tearing apart Vanguard's public filings to build an ironclad, mathematically perfect restructuring contract. I drank cold coffee and mapped every single legal loophole they could use to escape the trap. Friday night at 11 o'clock, there was a knock on my door. I didn't have visitors. I opened it to find Madeline standing in the hallway. She was holding a manila folder, wearing a trench coat over a simple sweater, looking entirely exhausted. I stepped aside, letting her in. My apartment was sparse, no art, minimal furniture, just the tools of my trade. I pointed her to the gray armchair and went to the kitchen to pour her a glass of water. When I returned, she was staring at the stack of legal pads and printed tax codes covering my coffee table. "You found the exact penalty," she said softly, reading the top sheet. "Clause 4B of the EU tax directive," I said, sitting on the edge of the sofa opposite her. I drafted the contract rewrite. It nullifies the acceleration clause completely, provided the core IP remains strictly under Gardner Logistics Management. Vanguard's legal team is ruthless, but they are driven by math. When they see the penalty, they will advise their board to accept our terms. It saves them $100 million in taxes. She looked from the papers to me. The silence in the room stretched, thick with exhaustion and something much deeper. "Why are you doing this, Jackson? You could have walked away when the audit started. You could have saved your license." It was the first time she had asked the question beneath the question. The air in the room grew intensely heavy. I wanted to close the distance between us. I wanted to sit next to her on that chair and show her exactly why I stayed. But I didn't. I stayed seated on the sofa. I kept my hands resting flat on my knees, locking my posture. "Because I despise people who break systems to steal what others built," I said, keeping my tone perfectly neutral, hiding the yearning behind a wall of professional fact. "And because you are the most competent CEO I have ever worked for. This company needs you to survive." It was the truth, but it was a fraction of the truth. She nodded slowly, her expression unreadable, and gathered the papers into the folder. "I'll see you at the board meeting tomorrow morning." When she left, the quiet of the apartment felt deafening. I had built the shield she needed to survive, but I wasn't sure if she wanted me standing behind it with her once the war was finally won. Saturday morning. The primary boardroom was a battleground. Vanguard's legal team was present via an encrypted conference call, their voices echoing off the speakerphone in the center of the table. Vance, despite being suspended, had managed to secure an observer seat through his board allies. He sat at the far end of the table, looking pale but defiant. Madeline stood at the head of the table. She didn't look at me for reassurance. She opened the folder I had given her last night. "Vanguard Holdings," Madeline said, her voice ringing with absolute, chilling authority. You triggered the debt acceleration clause under the premise of internal instability at Gardner Logistics. That premise was entirely fabricated by a rogue executive whose actions are currently under federal review for corporate sabotage. She slid a certified copy of the Ghost Ledger report across the table to the board chairman. Furthermore, your attempt to force liquidation violates the secondary covenants of the original debt issuance, which I have heavily documented. She didn't let the speakerphone interrupt. She controlled the airspace in the room perfectly. I watched her from the wall, admiring the absolute steel in her spine. I have drafted a comprehensive restructuring agreement, Madeline continued, signaling me to pass the bound documents around the table. It voids the acceleration immediately, locks the debt at the current interest rate for 5 years, and guarantees your quarterly returns. If you refuse to sign this by noon today, I will execute a command to open source our proprietary routing algorithms to the public domain, rendering the core asset you are trying to steal completely, legally, worthless to you. The speakerphone hissed with static. You're bluffing, Ms. Gardner, a sharp, condescending voice snapped from the Vanguard side. You would destroy your own valuation. Madeline looked directly at the speakerphone. I don't bluff. I have the upload sequence prepared on a timed server. I will burn this house down to the foundation before I let you steal it. Review page 4. Look at the tax penalty you will incur upon liquidation if the IP is public. The math is not in your favor. Silence. The heavy, crushing silence of highly paid lawyers doing rapid mental calculations. A full minute passed. Then the lead Vanguard attorney sighed, the sound echoing through the room. We will review the restructured terms and return a signature by noon. The meeting ended abruptly. Vanguard had folded. The board chairman turned to Vance. Security will escort you to your vehicle, Vance. You are permanently terminated from this facility. The boardroom emptied rapidly until it was just Madeline and me left in the vast, quiet space. The adrenaline of the confrontation was fading, leaving a profound, settling stillness in its wake. She stood by the window, looking out over the Chicago skyline, the afternoon sun finally cutting through the gray clouds. I walked up behind her, stopping 2 feet away. I didn't reach out to touch her. You handled them perfectly, I said, my voice quiet in the large room. The contract is secure. She turned around. The professional armor she had worn all morning, the flawless CEO persona, finally dropped completely. She stepped toward me, intentionally closing the distance I had meticulously maintained for the last 6 weeks. She stopped mere inches away, looking up at me. I couldn't have done it without the leverage you built, Jackson, she said. You executed the plan, I replied. You took the risk. That was all you. She shook her head. She reached out, her hand resting flat against my chest, right over my tie. The physical contact sent a jolt of absolute reality through me. It wasn't an electric spark of cliché romance. It was heavy. It felt exactly like dropping an anchor in a safe, quiet harbor after weeks at sea. I'm not talking about the company anymore, she whispered. I looked down at her. The exhaustion, the brutal fights with the board, the late nights parsing tax codes, it all suddenly felt resolved. I reached up and covered her hand with mine, holding it firmly against my chest. I didn't pull her into a frantic, desperate embrace. I simply stepped closer, eliminating the final inch of space between us. I leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't hungry, and it wasn't hurried. It was a destination. The chaotic noise of the last 2 months, the threats, the audits, the fear of losing everything, physically vanished from my mind, replaced by an absolute, unshakable certainty. It was a promise sealed in silence, a contract we had been writing through actions since the night I walked into her office. I pulled back slightly, resting my forehead against hers, just breathing in the quiet of the room, feeling the transfer of stability from my chest to hers. The following Monday, the office felt entirely different. The restructuring documents were signed and filed. The crisis was over. I was packing up my briefcase at the end of the day, organizing my audit files, when Madeline walked into the open plan accounting department. She didn't call me into her office via the intercom. She walked right up to my desk in full view of the remaining staff and junior accountants. "Are you finished for the day, Mr. Hart?" she asked, her tone professional, but her eyes were entirely warm and relaxed. "I am," I said, snapping the brass clasp of the briefcase shut. "Good." She looked around the room, making sure everyone was listening. "Because my partner promised to buy me dinner tonight to celebrate the Vanguard closure, and I don't like to be kept waiting." She said the word partner clearly, deliberately, letting it echo in the space, establishing the boundary and the truth simultaneously. I smiled, picking up my bag. "Let's go." I walked around the desk and offered her my arm. We walked to the elevators together, the silence between us no longer heavy with unspoken tension, but comfortable, grounded, and secure. Looking back on those months, I realized something fundamental. Love isn't about grand, sweeping rescues that strip someone of their agency or power. True partnership is about standing in the fire with someone, offering them the tools to fight, and trusting them to win their own battles. It's about consistency, respect, and knowing exactly when to hold the line so they can breathe. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.